Once you become a writer, you will never look at reading the same way again. Today I want to give writers some tips on how they can get the most out of their reading. What's up guys, my name is Brandon McNulty. I'm a writer and welcome to my writing channel. As I mentioned in the intro, today we're going to be talking about the subject of getting the most out of the novels you read. And this is a very important subject. It's also a very sad subject because once you make that jump from being a reader to becoming a writer, you have to accept that a lot of the magic will be lost when you do sit down to read books. And this is just something that happens as you learn more about plot structure and you learn more about how stories work. It's an unfortunate scenario, but if you do want to write great stories, you need to learn from the ones that you are reading or watching or whatever. So without any further ado, I want to share with you 3 tips that I think will help you learn faster and write better. Now, the first tip I have for you today is to address your weaknesses while you're reading. And by this I mean, when you're reading a story, keep in mind your own weaknesses as a writer. And I'm sure if you've done any writing in the past, you know that you have certain areas where you need to improve. It's nothing to be ashamed of. And if you are, reading a story and maybe you're having struggles with your writing in the area of maybe opening your chapters and you don't know how to write a great chapter opening, the next time you sit down and you read a book, pay extra close attention to the openings of chapters. And what you might do, instead of just paying close attention to it, you might actually write down some ones that you like, or, write down what you think about the ones you like. Maybe you like that it opens with an image, or you like that it opens with a flashy line of dialogue, or you like, just the description or the sentence length or the paragraph's momentum. Whatever it is, pay attention to these things and maybe mark them down, bank them for later so that you can apply them to your own work. My number 2 tip is what I call predicting the future. And by this I mean whenever you're reading a story and it hints at something that will happen down the line, something important or meaningful, whatever the scenario is where there's a setup and then later you're expecting that payoff, try to predict what that payoff will be. Now, the goal of this is not to get it exactly right, but you will want to, first of all, predict the most obvious payoff. Whatever it is, for instance, if you have a scenario like you have a detective finding a piece of evidence, you might say that the most obvious thing is that that evidence will convict the killer. I mean, that would be the most obvious thing. But I want you to take things a step further, and I want you to go and ask yourself the question, what is the most original or most wild or most outlandish thing that can happen as a payoff? And you'll have to, just run wild with this. Let your creative mind take over. Now, if you do this, whether you realize it or not, you will actually be brainstorming ideas for your own stories. You might not perfectly guess what the writers are doing in the book you're reading or the movie you're watching, but if you're coming up with these crazy ideas, bank them for later. Keep them in mind when you sit down to write. They may not pay off in the actual story you're reading, but they can pay off in the actual story you're writing. For instance, let's say you were watching Empire Strikes Back for the very first time, you didn't know what was going to happen, and you get to the scene where you find out that Darth Vader wants to capture Luke and present him to the Emperor as a gift. Once you see that scene, you know there's a setup and you know there's going to be a payoff later on in the story. If you had to guess the most obvious outcome, you would probably say, well, okay, Luke and Darth Vader are probably going to fight it out and Luke is going to win because he's the hero. And that would be a pretty fair prediction as far as, somebody seeing the movie for the first time. But as a writer, you need to take that next step forward. And I think you should also be thinking about other potential wild scenarios that can happen, even if they don't. Now, for instance, you might be watching that movie and you might think to yourself, well, maybe Luke will actually go and kill the Emperor himself, or maybe Luke will, take a hostage from the Empire and use it against Darth Vader to get, Han and Leia back, or maybe Luke will fly into Cloud City, lasers blasting, and he'll shoot up the building where Darth Vader is stationed, and he'll threaten to just, shoot the whole thing to smithereens unless he gets Leia and Han back. Now, you can come up with plenty of different scenarios, and they may never pan out in the work you're reading, but that doesn't mean that you can't bring them into your own work. So keep that in mind. Don't be afraid to think wildly while you are reading. My third and final tip for today is what I call learning new cliches. And of course, when we talk about cliches, we're talking about things that have been done a million times before. They can be phrases like, he was out of his mind, or they can be scenarios like the slasher film where you have a bunch of teenagers getting killed by an attacker, and then you have the final girl at the end who kills the attacker. I mean, we've seen that movie a million times before. But when you're reading a good story, typically the writer will take cliches and freshen them up in some way or another. Now, what you should be paying attention to while you're reading these types of stories is how they freshen up these cliches. For instance, let's go back to that example of the he was out of his mind cliche. We've seen that before, we've read it before a million times. But say you're reading a story and you come across a sentence, he was out of his skull. That's something different. That's something I would pay attention to and learn from that. Ask yourself, okay, the next time I write a story, can I use that that new cliche that he was out of his skull, and can I add my own variation to it? Maybe you're writing like an astronaut story and you say he was out of his helmet, or you have a character who's a bit of a whack job and he says he was out of his noggin, or he was out of his cranium, or whatever it is. Look for new ways to use cliches and to freshen them up. Now, as for big picture cliches like involving scenarios or events or whatever it is, again, if we go back to the idea of the teen slasher film, been done a million times before. I'm sick of seeing it. I can't stand those movies. But I did enjoy the movie Happy Death Day. In that movie, instead of the final girl surviving until the end, she gets killed several times throughout the story, which is fun, it's original, it's different. And every time she gets killed, she has to restart the same day, and she has to solve the mystery of who is her killer. That's a different take on the cliche. And as I was watching that story, I kept asking myself, what can I do if I ever write a slasher film that freshens it up in the way that Happy Death Day does? Is there some other new concept that I can bring to the story? Is there some new type of character or new type of twist? What can I bring to the story? Ask yourself, okay, the cliches are there. Is there a way I can make those cliches totally fresh again? If you can, you have yourself a story worth reading. So I hope these tips helped. Obviously, these are just 3 examples of what you should be looking for while you're reading, but there are, of course, tons of different things you can learn from reading novels, watching movies, whatever it is. Pay close attention, work on your weaknesses, ask yourself, how can I predict the future in a way that it can help my own writing somewhere down the line with fresh new ideas, and also pay attention to cliches and how writers play off them. Question of the day, what is one area of weakness you want to address in your own writing? Let us know in the comments section below. Thank you guys for watching. Be sure to check out my other videos. Hit the like and subscribe buttons for me. Share this video with a friend if you don't mind. And as always, remember to keep on writing.